Hi there. Hey, this is Dr. Tech again, and this time we're going to start with the concept of a return value. So let me show you the module for that particular topic. And hold on a second. Okay. So returning value is specified here, and that's what we'll be taking a look at. And once again, I think you can spend some time to read the document. So instead of reading the document, I'm going to use examples to illustrate how it works. And once again, we're going to use a spreadsheet. And we still have the same spreadsheet as earlier. And that's what we're going to do here. So we'll go ahead and start with an example that is really, really simple. So we'll define a subroutine called 5. And it's going to have a new statement, new kind of statement called return, and it's returning a value of 5. And define sub. There we go. And we'll have another one, say 7. So define sub 7. Oh, not sever, 7. There we go. And return 7. And define sub. And now we have another one called 12. So this one is a little bit more interesting because it's going to return the result of invoking 5 plus the result of invoking 7. And define sub. And now we have main. So from here on, we're going to use main as the actual main entry point. It has a local variable called x, and x gets the value of invoking 12. There we go. And define sub. And once again, on line 14, this invoke main would be implicit in the C program. But since we're still using pseudocode, that is explicit. So I'll indent everything that should be indented. And now we can trace the code. So start a new sheet. And then we can start to trace the code. All right, so tracing this code, we'll start with line number. There are no global variables, so the precondition really has not much to say. And then we start with line 14, which is an invocation. So this time it has the usual, which is a return line number of post, and it has a local variable. Main has one local variable x, so we'll allocate that column right now, but it has an unknown value to begin with. All right, so now we got these 2 columns done. And then we start with we start with row 8, which is the first line inside main, inside 12 that does, oh, no, I take it back. We have to start with line 12 because we are invoking main. So line 12 doesn't do a whole lot. Now this is the interesting part because line 12 has to evaluate the right hand side first before it can update x. So it has to invoke 12. But when 12 returns, we are not moving on to the next line. Instead, we are continuing what is left on this line to do. So from here on, when we are invoking a subroutine that returns a value, instead of return line number, we now say this is return info or information for returning. And the way we specify this kind of awkward situation where we have to go back to the same line but it has some unfinished business to perform is something like this. So we say we are returning to line 12, but we have to indicate what else on line 12 we have to do. So we still have the assignment to x that we have to do, and then the value of invoking 12 is going to return is now represented by a question mark that is going to be filled in a little bit later on. So this is the change from before. Instead of a return line number, we have return information or return info. And in return info, we indicate not only which line to get back to, but also what else needs to be done on that line. And also, we also need to replace the invocation itself with a single question mark that is kind of like a placeholder of the return value. So after this is done, we can now continue on to the subroutine called 12, and line 8 is what we need to do. So if you look at line 8, it is a single return statement, but we cannot specify what value it's going to return. So before we invoke both 5 and 7. So we will choose to read from left to right. So we're invoking 5 first. And because 5 also has a return value, this means we're not using return line number. Instead, we're using return info again. But this time we return to line 8, and the unfinished business is return and then the question mark, because the question mark is replacing invoke 5. But invoke 7 is not replaced by a single question mark because that is yet to be done. We are not invoking 7, we're invoking 5. So we're only replacing the invoke 5 with a question mark. When that is done, we go into 7, go to line 5, and this is the first time we can actually perform a single return statement by itself. So now the question is, what do we do when we do that? When we're on line 5, so what we do on line 5 is we look up the most recent or the rightmost return info column, which in this case is column E, and then we replace the question mark with the value that is being returned. In other words, we look at this and go like, okay, this 7, which is the return value of 7, is, oh, we're doing invoke 5 first. Okay, I take it back, sorry. We are invoking 5, so we're going to line 2 instead of line 5. But on line 2, it's kind of the same thing. We are only returning a constant. So what we do is we change the question mark of the rightmost return info column with the value that we are returning. In this case, it is just 5. So we go here, we copy and paste the return info cell, and then we change the question mark to the value that is being returned. So this is returning a value of 5, and that is why it is updated to a value of 5. Then we go to line 3. Line 3 is the end of the subroutine called 5. So we do about the same thing as usual, which means we look up the rightmost return, but this time it's return info cell, and that will tell us that we have to go back to line 8. But when we get back to line 8, we have to understand what line 8 has to do. So there are several ways to do this. I know it is going to be a little bit troublesome if you were to do this on the piece of paper, but this way we can clearly see what else we have to do when we get back to line 8. So the way I would do this is in the line number column, we're just going to say that entire thing. I know that makes line number column really, really wide, but that really helps us understand by the time we get back to line 8 what else needs to be done. So as usual, anything that is done or allocated on a per invocation basis needs to be deallocated. So in this case, return info is deallocated. So we'll indicate that is deallocated. And now execution continues on line 8. So when we get back to line 8, what is left on line 8 that we need to do is this statement here. The invoke 5 is already done. We know the value of invoking 5 is just 5 itself. So what is left to do now is invoking 7. So that means we're going to reallocate the leftmost available column and label as return info. And this time we will indicate that we have to go back to line 8. The return still has to be done. The 5 is already resolved, and then the invoke 7 is what we are trying to do now. So that invocation is replaced by a question mark as a placeholder for the return value of 7. When this is all done, we can continue execution in the called subroutine, which is 7. It starts on line 5. So now we get to line 5. Line 5 is a very simple return statement. It returns a value that we already know. And what that's going to do is we locate the rightmost return info cell, which is on column E. We copy and paste it, and then we change the question mark, which is the placeholder of the return value of this invocation, and we change it to the value that we are returning. On line 5, we're returning 7, so that's why the question mark is replaced with a value of 7. Now note that we are not changing 5 plus 7 to 12 at this point, because at this point, our only job is to replace the question mark with 7, not to evaluate what is 5 plus 7. So that is a very important point to remember. When this is all done, we move on to the next line, which is line 6. On line 6, we have two things to do. One thing is we have to remember where to get back to, which is in the return info cell. But in this case, we not only are we remembering where to return to, but we also have to remember what else on that line we have to do this time. So that's why we're just copying the return info cell into the line number column, because this clearly states what else we need to do when we get back to line 8. And then after that, the subroutine ends, so we deallocate everything that was allocated to that subroutine, which is just one single column, in this case, column E. And now we continue execution on line 8. This is actually the third time we get back to line 8. This is the first time, which invokes 5. This is the second time, which invokes 7. And this is the third time, which is actually going to perform the return. Because we know what is 5, we know what is 7. 5 plus 7 is 12. We're returning a value of 12. So what that's going to do is to locate the rightmost return info cell, which is column D this time, copy and paste that cell. And then we change the question mark, which is the placeholder of the return value of the invocation, with the value that we're returning, which is 12 in this case. And that's all we do. We do not change X at this point. This is not the time to perform the assignment. This is only going to change the question mark to the value that is being returned. When this is all done, we move on to the next line, which is line 9. That's the end of the subroutine. So when we move on to line 9, we have two things to do. We have to remember that we have to get back to line 12. So we copy the entire return info cell to column A, which is the line number column. And then after that, we also deallocate column D, because that is allocated on a per invocation basis. Now that we get back to line 12, we know that we only have to update X with a value of 12. So that's why X is now updated to a value of 12 at this point. And then we move on to line 13, which is the end of the main subroutine. Got two things to do. First of all, we have to look up return line number in this case, which is post. And also we have to remember to deallocate both of those columns. So we copy and paste the two columns here, and then we change the formatting of the text to strike through to indicate that they are deallocated. Column B and C are both deallocated. And now we're back to post, which means we're all done with this particular algorithm. So this is kind of a quick introduction to calling a subroutine that has a return value and how to utilize that return value. And once again, the main point is, if you are calling a subroutine that has a value to return, you do not use just a return line number. Instead, you use return info, and then you just repeat the entire line minus the invocation itself, which is replaced by a single question mark, because that is a placeholder of a return value to be specified when the return statement inside this called subroutine has something to return. Then we change the question mark to a specific value. All right, so I'm going to stop this particular clip right now, and then next time we'll continue with an example that might make use of most of the concepts that we have already mentioned. So we can combine the use of returning a value, passed by value, passed by reference, and local variables in the next example.